Visit us at Eduvvo. Thank you for calling Eduvvo.
CSS has powerful positioning properties that allow us to specify exactly where elements should appear on a page. In this video, we'll explore different positioning methods and learn how we can change the stacking order of a box with the z-index property. Let's get started. Now that we understand how the box model works, it's going to be much easier to understand positioning properties. We can specify different positioning schemes using the position property, which positions an element in the document flow using the top, right, bottom, or left offset properties. The position property can accept 4 values: static, relative, absolute, and fixed. So let's go over how each value affects positioning. By default, HTML elements are positioned static. When an element is static, it's always positioned according to the normal flow of the page, which, as we learned in the previous video, is the default way in which browsers display HTML elements. A position value of static, according to the W3 spec, is a normal box laid out according to the normal flow of the document, and it ignores any values for the top, right, bottom, and left properties, as well as any z-index declarations, which we'll cover shortly. So let's remember that if we do not declare a position value on an element, it will always be static. So in our browser, currently, these 3 boxes are all positioned static in our page because they have no positioning properties applied yet. Another position value we can use is relative. Relative positioning behaves similar to static positioning in that it changes an element without influencing the layout of other elements. It positions an element relative to its position in the document flow. So we can use the top, right, bottom, or left offset properties to indicate how far to move the element from where it would have been in the normal flow. So for our middle div here, I'll go ahead and add a left offset property of 150 pixels. We'll save that. When we refresh the page, we can see that when the div is offset to the left, it does not affect the position of the surrounding boxes. The same thing happens when we offset the top position. So let's go ahead and set the offset to 75 pixels from the top. And we'll see that the same happens when we offset the top position, and the positions of the surrounding boxes are also not affected. So as we just learned, when relative positioning is used to offset an element, it offsets it relative to its original position in the document. So that original position serves as the context in which the box gets positioned on the page. When absolute positioning is used, an element is completely removed from the normal document flow, and as a result, it no longer affects the position of other elements. So I'll go ahead and remove these offset values for now, and I'll change our position from relative to absolute. When we refresh the browser here, we can see that the original space of the box is no longer honored, and it has no impact on the surrounding elements. So now it sits on top of the bottom box. To set the location of an absolutely positioned element, we'll also need to use the top, right, bottom, or left offsets. So I'll include the previous positioning properties back in our CSS rule here. And we'll refresh the page, and we can see that it's once again positioned with those offsets. But as you'll notice, the positioning context is different. By default, when an element is absolutely positioned, the offsets we set are relative to the browser viewport. So as you can see here, the box is 75 pixels from the top of the viewport and 150 pixels to the left of it. Even if I resize the page, it will always stay relative to the viewport, and the surrounding elements will move behind it. But we can change the entire positioning context by adding a relative position to the parent or any ancestor element. For example, in this case, our parent element is the div with the class wrapper. So in our CSS, if we add a position property with the value relative to our wrapper rule, the wrapper div now becomes the positioning context for all of our boxes. So any top, right, bottom, or left offsets we add to our absolutely positioned box will be relative to the div with the class wrapper. So in our CSS, I'll go ahead and change the left offset to a right offset of 0, and we'll make the top into a bottom offset, and we'll also make this 0. We'll refresh the page, and now we can see that the box is positioned in the bottom right corner of the wrapper div. We'll need to keep in mind that the absolute position will always be relative to the first parent element that has a position other than static. If neither the parent element or any parent element up the nesting chain have these positioning properties set, then the element is positioned relative to the browser window or viewport. This means that we can also position any element absolute within other elements that are absolutely positioned. For example, in our CSS, I'll go ahead and paste in a new rule here that generates another box inside of our middle div using the after pseudo element. As you can see, the position is also set to absolute, and the bottom and left offsets are set to 0. When we refresh the page, we can see how the generated box is positioned in the bottom left corner of the middle box. So it's really neat that we can also position generated content this way. Fixed positioning is another positioning method that works similar to absolute positioning, except there are a few differences. A fixed position element will always stay fixed in the same location, regardless of the browser window or if we scroll up and down the page. A great example of fixed positioning is the Twitter header, which, as you can see, it always stays fixed to the top of the viewport. Fixed positioning will always be relative to the viewport. So even if we add a relative position to a parent element, the positioning context will never change. For this example, I created a new page containing several paragraphs just so the page is scrollable. In our HTML, just above the wrapper div here, we'll go ahead and create a new div, and we'll give it the class of fixed. Back in our CSS, we'll create a new rule for our fixed div. So we'll go ahead and add a position with a value of fixed. Then we'll apply a width of 100%. We'll give it a height of 60 pixels and a background color of black. And we'll also need to add an offset, so we'll give it a top property with a value of 0. When we refresh the page, as you can see, the fixed div overlaps the other elements, but stays fixed to the edges of the browser window, similar to the Twitter page. As we've noticed, when relative, absolute, and fixed positioning is used, the boxes can overlap each other. With the z-index property, we can change the natural stacking order of elements. Z-index adds a third dimension to a page and sets the stack order of elements on the z-axis. So higher z-index values sit on top of lower z-indexes and move towards the front of the page. So if this here is the viewport, an element with a z-index of 20 will appear over the top of one with a z-index of 10, and an element with a z-index of 30 will appear over the ones with z-indexes of 20 and 10. So let's go ahead and try that in our CSS. A z-index can only be applied to elements positioned absolute, fixed, or relative. So for our top div, we'll go ahead and give it a position property with a value relative, and we'll apply a z-index of 10. Our middle div is already positioned absolute, but we'll go ahead and give our middle div here a z-index of 20, so it sits about right in the middle. And once again, we'll give a position relative to our bottom box and a z-index value of 30. When we refresh, we can see that the stack order changed. And now the bottom div, because it has a higher z-index, overlaps the middle div. And the middle div overlaps the top div, which has a z-index of 10. You can see how this works a little better if we apply a top offset of negative 25 pixels to our bottom div. Now when we refresh, we can see that when it shifts up, it still overlaps our top div in our page. When using any of the position properties, we'll need to remember that we cannot apply both positioning and a float to an element, because it does create conflicting positioning schemes. So that wraps things up for the CSS box model. Nice job! On our next deep dive, we'll take our page layouts a step further with advanced background and border properties. We'll see you then.